Silas Romano had orchestrated wars, buried enemies, and carved his name into the underworld with blood and precision. He had never once hesitated, never once faltered. But on the morning of his wedding, to a woman who despised him, he stood at the altar and made a discovery that would destroy him. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was fall in love. The church was a cathedral of silence and tension, its Gothic arches soaring into shadows that seemed to press down with the weight of history and hatred. Silas stood at the altar with the posture of a man facing execution, straight-backed, expressionless, his hands clasped in front of him with military precision. His tailored black suit was perfect, not a thread out of place. His dark hair combed back to reveal the sharp angles of a face that had been trained since childhood to reveal nothing. Around him, two families who'd spent decades destroying each other now sat in forced civility, their hatred barely contained beneath expensive suits and designer dresses. The Romanos on one side, the Vitales on the other, with an aisle between them that felt less like a walkway and more like a demilitarized zone. This wedding was a treaty written in flesh instead of ink, a cold political calculation that would bind the families together through marriage rather than murder. The violence had escalated too far, cost too much, threatened to draw unwanted attention from authorities who'd been carefully paid to look the other way. The old men who ran things had decided, enough. A union would be forged. Blood would mix. The war would end. And Silas, as the Romano heir, would be the sacrifice on that particular altar. He'd accepted his role without question, without protest, without the slightest flicker of emotion. Marriage was simply another tactical move, another piece positioned on the board in the endless game of power and territory. He'd never met Bianca Vitale, knew nothing about her except her name and her family's long list of grievances against his own. She was 23, he'd been told, educated, the youngest daughter of Dante Vitale, which made her expendable enough to be offered up, but valuable enough to seal the deal. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Love was a weakness Silas had never understood, never wanted, never allowed himself to consider. He'd watched it destroy men, watched them make stupid decisions, compromise their positions, get themselves and their families killed because they couldn't think past their feelings. Silas had built his life on the absence of such vulnerability. He was cold, controlled, efficient. A perfect machine in an imperfect world, this arrangement required only duty and distance. He would marry this woman, install her in his home, ensure she was provided for, and continue his work exactly as he had before. They would appear together when necessary, maintain the fiction of unity, and otherwise exist in separate spheres. Clean, simple, manageable. The organ music swelled, filling the church with sound that reverberated off stone walls and stained glass windows. The congregation rose as one, the rustle of fabric and shifting of bodies creating a wave of movement that rippled through the pews. Silas turned toward the entrance with the mechanical precision of a man performing a rehearsed action. He expected to see a woman, any woman, walking toward him. A face to assign to a name, a body to occupy the space beside him in photographs and public appearances. Perhaps she would be plain, which would make ignoring her easier. Perhaps she would be beautiful but vapid, which would accomplish the same thing. Perhaps she would be terrified or angry, or resigned. He was prepared for anything, except what he saw. Bianca Vitale appeared at the entrance of the church, and Silas felt the world tilt violently sideways. She moved down the aisle like a weapon wrapped in white silk, and every step she took rewrote something fundamental in Silas's understanding of reality. She was small, delicate-boned, with dark hair swept back from her face in an elegant twist that revealed the graceful column of her neck. Her dress was simple, classic, without the ostentation that might have been expected. Just clean lines that moved with her body like water. But it was her face that destroyed him. Bianca Vitale had a face of such fierce, luminous beauty that Silas's throat closed around his next breath. High cheekbones, full lips pressed into a line that suggested both strength and suppressed emotion. Skin like porcelain, features that belonged in Renaissance paintings. the kind of face that artists spent lifetimes trying to capture. And her eyes. God, her eyes. Those eyes burned with a hatred so pure, so consuming, that Silas felt it like a physical blow to his chest. They were dark, almost black in the church's dim light, and they fixed on him with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years planning murder and was finally face to face with their target. She looked at him the way hunters looked at prey, the way executioners looked at the condemned, the way enemies looked at each other across battlefields before the first shot was fired. Every step she took toward him radiated loathing so potent it was almost visible, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. And Silas, who had never in his life cared what anyone thought of him, who had built fortresses around his emotions and trained himself to be impervious to others' opinions, felt that hatred sink into his chest like a blade finding its mark. His heart, which had been beating with mechanical regularity, suddenly slammed against his ribs with shocking violence. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, a rhythm he didn't recognize, couldn't control, couldn't understand. His breath hitched, actually hitched, like he'd been punched, like the air had been knocked from his lungs. His carefully maintained composure wavered for the first time in years, cracks appearing in the perfect facade he'd spent a lifetime constructing, and somewhere in the cold, tactical architecture of his mind, in the precise, logical framework he'd built to navigate the world without the messy complications of emotion. A.E. fault line cracked open with the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. She was 20 feet away. 15, 10. Silas couldn't look away. Couldn't think. Couldn't form a single coherent thought that didn't center entirely on the woman walking toward him. His peripheral vision had gone dark, the church and its occupants fading into irrelevance. There was only her, only the way she moved with controlled grace, despite what must have been tremendous internal turmoil. Only the set of her shoulders square and defiant. Only the slight tremor in her hands where they gripped her bouquet. White roses, and something else he couldn't identify, didn't care about. Because all that mattered was that those hands were trembling, and he wanted desperately to know if it was from fear or fury, or both. 5 feet away. 3. Her scent reached him. Something clean and subtly floral. Orange blossom, maybe, utterly at odds with the violence radiating from her gaze. The contradiction was dizzying. She stopped beside him at the altar, exactly where the priest had indicated, and the heat of her presence felt like standing too close to a fire. Silas was acutely, devastatingly aware of the 6 inches of space between them, of the way her chest rose and fell with controlled breathing that suggested she was working very hard to maintain composure, of the tension in her shoulders that spoke of muscles held rigid against the urge to flee or fight. She was the most exquisite thing he'd ever seen, and she hated him with every fiber of her being. The priest began speaking, some traditional, words about holy matrimony and sacred bonds, platitudes about love and commitment that rang hollow in this church filled with people who knew exactly what this marriage was and wasn't. Silas heard nothing. His entire consciousness had narrowed to the woman beside him, to the way her jaw clenched when the priest said their names together, Silas Romano and Bianca Vitale, as though the syllables were poison on her tongue. To the slight tremor in her hands when she was prompted to accept his ring, a tremor that made him want to reach out and steady her fingers, to warm them, to somehow communicate that he meant her no harm even though his very existence clearly caused her pain. When it was his turn to speak, Silas's voice came out steady, despite the absolute chaos in his chest, despite his heart hammering so hard he could feel his pulse in his throat. He said the words, ancient, binding words about honoring and cherishing and remaining faithful, and meant them with a ferocity that shocked him down to his foundations. This woman who hated him, this enemy made bride through circumstances neither of them had chosen, had somehow become the center of his universe in the span of minutes. They exchanged rings. The moment Silas touched Bianca's hand to slide the band onto her finger, her skin was ice cold against his, and he had to fight the irrational urge to warm those frozen fingers, to protect them, to keep touching her, until that coldness disappeared and was replaced by the heat he could feel radiating from her, despite her trembling. The ceremony concluded with more words Silas didn't hear. They turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, and Silas was acutely aware of every point where their bodies nearly touched but didn't. The space between his shoulder and hers, the gap between their hands, the careful distance she maintained as though proximity to him might contaminate her. The crowd began to applaud, polite, formal applause that barely concealed decades of enmity and did nothing to mask the underlying tension that pervaded the church like a living thing. As they walked back down the aisle together, Bianca's hand resting formally on his arm, with the lightness of something that wanted to pull away, someone in the back rows dropped a glass. The sharp crack of shattering crystal cut through the applause like a gunshot, and Bianca flinched. A small, involuntary movement that sent her fractionally closer to him, her body seeking shelter before her mind could override the instinct. Silas's arm tightened around hers instantly, purely protective, purely instinctive, a response that came from somewhere deeper than thought, more fundamental than logic, and in that moment, walking out of the church with his new wife trembling slightly against his side, her warmth seeping through the layers of fabric between them, Silas Romano, the cold air, the tactical genius, the man who felt nothing and prided himself on that emptiness, knew with a certainty that terrified him that his fate was now hopelessly, irrevocably entwined with the exquisite defiance in Bianca Vitale's eyes. He had fallen, completely, irreversibly, and she despised him. The suite they'd been given was a monument to false luxury, all silk wallpaper in muted gold, crystal chandeliers that caught and fractured light into 1,000 glittering pieces, furniture that looked expensive but felt cold, a stage set for a marriage that existed only on paper and in the political calculations of old men who traded lives like chess pieces. Silas closed the door behind them, and the sound of the lock clicking into place echoed through the room with the finality of a prison cell ceiling, of a trap springing shut, of something irrevocable being set into motion. Bianca moved immediately, decisively to the far side of the room, putting the massive 4-poster bed between them like a barricade, like a moat, like all the distance she could manufacture in a space that was still suffocatingly small for what was happening between them. She stood with her back near the window, the evening light filtering through sheer curtains and painting her in shades of amber and gold that made her look ethereal, untouchable, like something from a dream that would vanish if he reached for it. In the soft lamplight, without the veil that had partially obscured her face during the ceremony, without the crowd of witnesses watching their every move, she looked even more devastating, even more furious. The hatred that had burned in her eyes during the ceremony hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified, concentrated by privacy into something that felt dangerous, combustible, like she was a breath away from violence. They stood there in silence that stretched and pulled taut like a wire about to snap. The space between them crackled with tension. Not the electric anticipation that might exist between newlyweds, but something darker, more volatile, the kind of tension that preceded explosions. Silas should have spoken first, should have established boundaries, explained the arrangement in clear terms, laid out the rules of their coexistence, so there would be no misunderstandings, no false expectations. He'd rehearsed it in his mind during the reception. A calm, rational speech about separate lives and mutual respect, and the political necessity that had brought them to this point. But he couldn't form words. Could only stand there memorizing every detail of her face with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The way her chest rose and fell with barely controlled emotion. The way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides as though she was physically restraining herself from action. The slight tremor in her jaw that suggested she was grinding her teeth. She was breathtaking in her fury. Then Bianca moved, and everything changed. She reached into the folds of her wedding dress, into some hidden pocket sewn into the silk, and withdrew a blade. Small, wickedly sharp, the kind of weapon designed to be concealed against a body, to pass through security unnoticed, to be used when all other options had failed. The handle was wrapped in dark leather. The blade caught the lamplight and gleamed with lethal promise. She held it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Her grip steady despite the tremor Silas had noticed in her hands moments before. When she spoke, her voice was low and trembling with generations of accumulated pain, with a grief that had been handed down like an inheritance. with rage that had been nursed and fed and cultivated until it became the defining characteristic of her existence. "I know what you are," she said. And each word was carved from ice and fury. "What your family is, what they did to mine." Her hand tightened on the blade, knuckles going white with the pressure. "My uncle. They found him in the river with his throat cut. My cousin was 19 when your people burned that warehouse. 19. He died screaming, Silas Romano, along with 16 others who had families, who had children, who had lives your people decided weren't worth protecting." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, emotion breaking through the careful control she was trying to maintain. "They sent me here like a lamb to slaughter," she continued, her eyes boring into his with laser intensity. "Dressed me up, walked me down that aisle, handed me over to you like property to be claimed. But I am not a lamb, Silas Romano. I am not some helpless girl who will submit to this obscenity just because old men made agreements over wine and cigars." She turned the blade toward herself with deliberate slowness, bringing the tip to rest against the delicate skin of her wrist, where Silas could see her pulse beating frantically beneath the surface. "I will end my own life before I let you touch me," she said, and her voice had gone quiet in the way that suggested absolute conviction. "Before I let you claim what was stolen from my family. Before I become another casualty in this war that should have ended with blood instead of this mockery of a marriage." The world stopped. Silas had witnessed death in countless forms throughout his life in the organization, had ordered it, had executed it personally when necessary, had watched men die begging and defiant and everything in between. He'd seen people face their mortality with courage and cowardice in equal measure, had become numb to it, hardened by necessity and survival, trained to see death as simply another tool, another lever to be pulled when the situation demanded it. But the sight of that blade against Bianca's skin, against the translucent, vulnerable skin of her wrist, where blue veins traced delicate patterns beneath the surface, eclipsed every thought in his head except one singular, overwhelming imperative. She had to be safe. His heart, which had been racing since she'd pulled the blade, seemed to halt entirely. His throat went desert dry, his mouth filled with the taste of copper and fear. Every possessive instinct that had been building since he first saw her walking down that aisle dissolved like smoke, burned away by pure, desperate terror. "Stop." The word came out rough, barely more than a whisper, carrying none of the authority he was known for. "Please stop." Bianca's hand didn't waver. The blade remained pressed to her wrist, not breaking skin yet, but close enough that Silas could see the slight depression it made against her flesh. "Give me one reason," she said flatly. "One reason I should believe that being your wife will be anything other than a slower, more humiliating death than this blade would provide." Silas stepped back, deliberately, visibly. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, palms out, fingers spread showing he held no weapon, posed no immediate threat, something he'd never done in his life. Something that went against every instinct he possessed, every lesson he'd been taught about power and dominance and never showing weakness. "Because I vow to you," he said, and his voice was raw with sincerity that surprised even him, stripped of all the careful modulation he usually employed. "On my name, on my future, on whatever tattered remains of my soul still exist after the life I've lived. I will never violate your trust. I will never take what isn't freely given. I will never force myself on you or claim rights over your body just because some ceremony said words and we exchanged rings." Bianca stared at him, the blade still pressed to her skin, her eyes searching his face for deception, for the trap, for whatever angle he was working, because in their world, nobody offered anything without expecting something in return. "You expect me to believe that?" Her voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're a Romano. Taking what you want without asking permission is what you do. It's in your blood. Your father, your uncle, your brother. They take and take and take until there's nothing left. Not from you." Silas's hands were shaking. Actually shaking. Trembling with adrenaline and fear and emotions he couldn't name. He clenched them into fists to hide the weakness, to maintain some shred of the control he was famous for. "Never from you. You have my word, Bianca. My absolute unbreakable vow. This marriage may be a political arrangement, but I will not dishonor myself or you by forcing anything you don't choose to give freely." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Bianca's eyes searched his face with an intensity that felt like being dissected, like she was peeling back layers to find the truth beneath. Silas stood perfectly still under that scrutiny, his hands still raised in surrender, and let her look. Let her see whatever truth she could find in him, whatever evidence existed that his word might actually mean something. "You'll sleep there," Bianca said finally, gesturing toward the velvet chaise lounge positioned near the window. It was a decorative piece of furniture, beautiful but impractical, clearly never intended for actual sleeping. "You'll keep your distance. You'll never enter my space without explicit permission. You'll never touch me, never speak to me unless absolutely necessary. Never—" "Yes," Silas agreed immediately, cutting off the list of restrictions before she could continue. "Whatever you need. Whatever makes you feel safe. And if you break this vow," her voice was cold, deadly serious, "if you try anything, if you come near me with intentions I haven't explicitly approved, I won't. Simple. Absolute. Final." Bianca lowered the blade slowly, reluctantly, as though part of her regretted the necessity. She moved to the nightstand beside the bed and placed the weapon there deliberately, where it would remain visible, within easy reach, a constant reminder of her willingness to use it if his vow proved false. Then she turned her back on him, a gesture of either trust or contempt, Silas couldn't tell which, and began removing her jewelry with mechanical precision. Earrings first, then the necklace that had glittered at her throat during the ceremony, then the pins that held her hair in its elegant twist. She worked in silence, each movement controlled and deliberate, refusing to acknowledge his presence any more than absolutely necessary. Silas stood frozen, watching her, and he should have felt relief that the immediate crisis had passed, that she'd lowered the blade and accepted his vow, should have felt proud of his control, his ability to navigate a dangerous situation with words instead of force. Instead, he felt only the crushing weight of what he'd just promised, the knowledge that he'd sworn to deny himself the one thing he wanted more than his next breath, that he would spend every day in proximity to this woman who'd somehow become essential to his existence in the span of hours, and he could never reach for her, never touch her, never close the distance between them unless she explicitly granted permission. He moved to the chaise lounge and sat rigidly, still wearing his wedding suit because changing would require accessing the wardrobe, and he wasn't sure if that counted as invading her space. The furniture was decorative, elegant, never meant for sleeping. His body would ache by morning, his back would protest, he'd be stiff and miserable, he didn't care. Discomfort was a small price to pay for her safety, for her trust, for the hope that someday she might look at him without hatred burning in her eyes. Bianca extinguished the main lights, leaving only a small lamp burning near her bed, perhaps because she didn't trust the darkness, didn't trust that his vow would hold if she couldn't see him. She climbed under the covers, still fully clothed in her wedding dress, the silk pooling around her, and turned to face the wall, presenting him with her back, with her dismissal, with her absolute rejection of what this night was supposed to be. Silas stared at the ceiling and listened to her breathing, shallow at first, rapid, the breathing of someone fighting panic or tears or both. Gradually it slowed, deepened, though he could tell from the tension in her shoulders that she wasn't sleeping. Just pretending, waiting for him to prove her expectations right, to reveal himself as the monster she believed him to be. The blade glinted on the nightstand, catching the lamplight. A reminder, a barrier, a promise he would die before breaking. His love had been born in that moment of surrender, a profound, agonizing promise whispered to the shadows while his new wife lay 20 feet away. Separated by space and hatred and justified fear, he loved her with a ferocity that felt like madness, with an intensity that he didn't understand and couldn't control, with a certainty that had no logical foundation, but felt more real than anything he'd ever experienced. And he would spend every day of their marriage proving that his word meant something, that honor existed even in their dark world, that love could be patient and selfless and completely one-sided, even if it killed him, even if she never stopped hating him, even if the most beautiful thing in his life remained forever out of reach, visible but untouchable, existing in his space but never truly his. The days that followed established a brutal routine carved from ice and careful avoidance. Bianca treated their shared space like a battlefield requiring constant tactical vigilance. She mapped the suite's geography with military precision, memorizing Silas's patterns and schedules to minimize contact. She used the bathroom only when he was elsewhere, waiting until she heard his footsteps descend the stairs for breakfast before emerging from her room. She ate her meals at different times, orchestrating her hunger around his absence. When business required his presence in the suite during daylight hours, she retreated to the small reading room that had become her sanctuary, her refuge, the one space she'd claimed as entirely her own. When they were forced into proximity, passing in hallways, occupying the same room during the rare occasions when both had business that kept them there. She maintained a careful distance measured in feet, rather than inches, her body language radiating contempt so precise it felt like its own form of violence, a contempt that was deliberate, practiced, performed with the dedication of someone who understood that hatred was a shield against something more dangerous. She avoided his gaze like a weapon she refused to give him, looking past him, through him, anywhere but directly at him, because eye contact implied acknowledgement, and acknowledgement implied relationship, and relationship implied something she was determined to deny existed between them. And Silas, who had built an empire on ruthless focus and tactical precision, who could spend 16 hours negotiating complex deals without losing concentration, who prided himself on an almost superhuman ability to maintain control regardless of circumstances, found his legendary discipline disintegrating under the weight of his obsession with the woman who lived in his home and treated him like a disease she was trying not to catch. He couldn't work anymore. Not really, not the way he had before. He would sit at his desk with contracts spread before him, numbers and clauses that required careful analysis, deals that represented millions of dollars and complex webs of alliance and obligation. His eyes would move across the pages without comprehension, his brain refusing to process the information because all his mental capacity was consumed by thoughts of Bianca. Where was she right now? What was she doing? Was she comfortable? Did she need anything? Had she eaten enough at breakfast, or had she been too anxious to finish her meal? The reading room she'd claimed. Was it warm enough, or should he adjust the heating without her knowing? The book she'd been carrying yesterday. Had she finished it? And if so, should he acquire the next one in the series? His associates called meetings that he attended physically while remaining mentally absent. They would present expansion plans, territorial negotiations, profit projections that should have commanded his complete attention. Silas would nod at appropriate moments, offer minimal responses that technically answered questions, all while his mind was occupied by the memory of how Bianca's wrist had looked that morning when she'd reached for her coffee cup at breakfast. Delicate, elegant, devastatingly fragile, the same wrist she'd pressed a blade against on their wedding night. His father asked him questions about their operations in the southern districts. Silas answered with the bare minimum required, his thoughts consumed by the fact that Bianca had smiled at the housekeeper yesterday. A small, genuine smile that had lasted maybe 3 seconds, but had made Silas's chest feel like it was caving in, like his ribs were compressing around his heart, because he would have traded everything he owned, every asset and alliance and carefully accumulated advantage, just to be the recipient of that expression, to have her look at him with warmth instead of ice, with acceptance instead of hatred. He was falling apart in slow motion, unraveling thread by thread, and nobody seemed to notice because he'd become so skilled at maintaining the facade of competence, even as everything inside him dissolved into chaos. The small things destroyed him most, completely. He noticed everything about her with the obsessive intensity of a man losing his mind, cataloging details that should have been meaningless, but instead felt vital, essential, like information his survival depended on possessing. The scent of the lavender soap she used. He could smell it in hallways she'd walked through hours earlier. Could identify it instantly even mixed with other odors. Could follow it like a tracking dog following a scent trail. He'd found himself standing in an empty corridor one afternoon, breathing deeply, trying to capture more of that fragrance like an addict seeking a fix. The way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was reading, her fingers moving with unconscious grace, the gesture so habitual she probably didn't even know she did it. Silas had watched her do it 17 times during a single evening when they'd both been in the library, had counted each occurrence like a miser counting coins, had memorized the exact angle of her wrist, the curve of her fingers, the way the lamplight caught on her skin, the soft sound of her footsteps on the marble floors, distinct from every other sound in the house because he'd memorized the exact rhythm of her walk. The slight hesitation in her left step that suggested an old injury, maybe from childhood. The way she moved more quietly when she thought he might be nearby, trying to minimize her presence, to pass through shared spaces like a ghost who didn't want to be acknowledged. One afternoon, Silas found a napkin on the dining table where Bianca had eaten breakfast alone hours earlier. A simple linen square, creamy white, completely unremarkable except for the intricate pattern she'd sketched on it idly during her meal. Delicate flowers interconnected with geometric precision, roses maybe, or peonies, rendered in the blue ink of what must have been the pen she carried in her bag. The kind of absent-minded artistry that revealed something about the person who'd created it, something about the way her mind worked, the way she saw beauty and pattern and connection even in moments of solitude. Silas stared at that napkin for a full minute, standing motionless in the dining room with morning light streaming through windows, and felt something in his chest crack open wider. Then he folded it meticulously, creasing the linen along precise lines, ensuring the pattern remained visible, and placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket, right over his heart. The gesture was absurd, foolish, pathetic, the action of a lovesick teenager, not a Mafia Heir who was supposed to be cold and controlled and above such weakness. His security chief would have laughed if he'd seen it. His father would have been disgusted. Anyone who knew Silas Romano's reputation would have found the image incomprehensible. The ruthless tactician carrying around a napkin like a talisman, like a love letter, like something precious that needed to be kept close to his body. But the weight of that napkin against his chest, the knowledge that he was carrying something she'd touched, something she'd created, something that had been in contact with her hands and held her attention however briefly, provided a shocking wave of comfort that he couldn't rationalize away and didn't want to. He kept it there. Changed it carefully to different jackets when he changed clothes, treated it like the precious artifact it had become in his private mythology. The breaking point came during a formal dinner, with both families one of the regular gatherings designed to demonstrate the alliance's stability, to show that the peace was holding, that the merger of bloodlines was proceeding according to plan. They sat at an enormous table in the Romano estate's grand dining room, surrounded by relatives who watched them with calculating eyes, looking for signs of discord, evidence that the alliance was failing, weakness that could be exploited. The table was laden with excessive food, multiple courses prepared by the best chefs, wine that cost more than most people earned in a year, crystal and silver that glittered under chandeliers. Silas and Bianca performed their roles with mechanical precision that had become routine. They sat beside each other because the optics demanded it, maintained appropriate distance, spoke when spoken to, presented the image of a couple that was distant but polite, civil but cold, not happy but not openly hostile, exactly what was expected from an arranged marriage in their world. Someone, one of Bianca's cousins, Silas thought, though he was too distracted to be certain, asked Bianca a question about the wine they were serving with the third course. A Barolo from Piedmont, something about the vintage and the vineyard's reputation. Bianca responded, and her entire demeanor shifted in a way that hit Silas like a physical blow. She spoke with genuine knowledge, with enthusiasm that broke through her carefully maintained mask of indifference. Something about the vintage year, about the particular characteristics of Nebbiolo grapes grown in that specific region, about how the tannins developed over time, and the notes of tar and roses that distinguished exceptional Barolos from merely good ones. Her face lit up fractionally when she spoke, not a full smile, but something close, a brightening of her features that suggested the intelligent, passionate woman who existed beneath the armor of hatred she wore in his presence. She cared about this, knew about it, had probably studied wine the way she seemed to study everything that interested her, with thorough attention and genuine curiosity. And Silas's vision blurred. His hands were resting on the table, fingers loose around the stem of his wine glass. He clenched them into fists under the linen tablecloth, his knuckles going white with the force required to sit still, to not reach for her, to not do something catastrophic like touch her hand or speak her name just to hear her acknowledge his existence, to not lean closer and ask her to keep talking, to tell him everything she knew about wine or any other subject that made her face light up like that, because that expression, that glimpse of her genuine self, was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and he would have endured any pain, paid any price, just to see it again. The sound of her voice when she cared about something, when she forgot to hide behind contempt and just existed in her intelligence and interest, sent electricity racing through his nervous system and made his heart pound so hard he was certain everyone at the table could hear it. Every breath she took was a debt his heart owed, and he was quickly, catastrophically becoming bankrupt. The dinner continued. Silas participated minimally, offering monosyllabic responses when directly addressed, maintaining the bare minimum of social engagement required. All his focus was on Bianca, on the way she held her wine glass, on the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was uncomfortable despite her composed exterior, on the careful way she avoided letting their arms touch, even though they were sitting close enough that contact would have been natural. That night, unable to sleep on the too small chaise lounge that had become his nightly torture, his body aching from the uncomfortable position, his mind refusing to quiet, Silas stood by the window of their suite and stared out at the estate grounds bathed in moonlight. The moon was full, painting everything in silver and shadow, turning the manicured gardens into something ethereal and strange, and somewhere in the distance, in the east wing of the house, a light was burning in one of the upper windows. Silas knew, with absolute, irrational certainty, that light was in Bianca's reading room. The small space she'd claimed as her sanctuary, where she retreated when sleep wouldn't come, when the weight of their situation became too much, when she needed to escape even the limited proximity of their shared suite. She was awake. Maybe reading. Maybe just sitting there in the darkness with a single lamp burning, thinking thoughts he would never be privy to, feeling emotions he would never be allowed to understand. The urge to walk there, to simply exist in the same room as her, to breathe the same air and maybe, if she was reading, to see what book held her attention, was so overwhelming that Silas had to grip the window frame with both hands to anchor himself. His fingers pressed against the wood until they ached, until the physical pain provided a counterpoint to the emotional agony of restraint. He needed her so fiercely that the thought of her smiling at someone else, at anyone else, at the housekeeper or her cousin, or some hypothetical person who might someday earn her genuine affection, felt like physical mutilation. Like someone was taking a blade to his internal organs and carving them out piece by piece. The fear wasn't that he would lose control and violate his vow. That thought didn't even occur to him anymore. His word was absolute, unbreakable, more fundamental to his identity than his name or his position or his carefully cultivated reputation. The fear was that he would go mad maintaining it. That this distance, this careful avoidance, this life of existing in proximity to the woman he loved while being eternally separated from her by walls built from justified hatred and necessary boundaries, would break something in him that couldn't be repaired, that he would wake up one morning hollowed out, emptied of everything except this aching, unrequited love that had no outlet, no resolution, no hope of reciprocation. Silas released the window frame and flexed his aching fingers, drew a shaking breath, turned away from that distant light because looking at it was torture, was feeding an obsession that was already consuming him, was making everything worse. He returned to the chaise lounge and lay down in the darkness, still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling and listening for sounds from Bianca's room that never came. This was his life now. This was what he'd chosen when he made that vow, when he'd prioritized her safety and autonomy over his own desires, when he'd decided that loving her meant respecting her boundaries even when it destroyed him. And somewhere in the expensive silence of their suite, with moonlight streaming through windows and the knowledge that she was awake somewhere in the house, but would never seek him out, never want his presence, never look at him with anything except contempt, Silas Romano acknowledged a truth that both terrified and defined him. He was in love with a woman who despised him. Completely, helplessly, devastatingly in love, and he would spend every day of the rest of his life honoring a vow that meant she could never be his, maintaining boundaries that protected her from him, living in proximity to the only person who mattered while being eternally, agonizingly separated from her by walls he'd helped build with his own promise. The Vittorio Gala was the social event of the season, a gathering of the most powerful families in the organization, where alliances were displayed and rivalries simmered beneath champagne and false smiles. Attendance was mandatory, performance was expected. Silas and Bianca arrived together, her hand resting formally on his arm as they entered the ballroom. She wore midnight blue silk that moved like water against her skin, and when Silas first saw her descending the stairs of their suite, the wind had been taken out of his lungs. She was devastating. The dress revealed the elegant curve of her shoulders, the delicate architecture of her collarbones. Her hair was swept up, exposing the vulnerable line of her neck. She'd applied subtle makeup that made her eyes look enormous, luminous, impossible to look away from. Silas had stood at the bottom of the stairs and forgotten how to breathe properly. His heart slammed against his ribs, his mouth went dry, and every carefully constructed defense he'd built around his feelings crumbled into dust. She'd walked past him without meeting his eyes. Her perfume, different tonight, something with jasmine and darkness, wrapping around him like a physical touch. Now, in the ballroom, that proximity was palpable torture. They were required to stay close, to present a united front. Bianca stood beside him as they greeted other families, her body radiating tension that only Silas seemed to notice. Every time she moved, every time she shifted her weight or adjusted her dress, he was acutely aware of it. The brush of her elbow against his jacket, the whisper of silk against his leg when she turned, the heat radiating from her skin despite the 6 inches of space she maintained between them. Silas's heart rate was soaring. His breathing felt shallow, controlled only through immense effort. Sweat threatened at his temples despite the ballroom's careful climate control. He spoke to associates, made small talk with allies, discussed business with his father's contemporaries, but his mind was chaos. Every word he spoke felt disconnected from his brain, automated responses delivered by some functioning part of him, while the rest of his consciousness was consumed by Bianca's presence. She was mingling with a group of women across the room. Silas was supposed to be listening to his uncle discuss expansion into the port districts. Instead, his gaze was fixated on her. The way she held her champagne glass, the graceful movement of her hands when she gestured, the polite smile she offered that didn't reach her eyes. His uncle asked him a question. Silas responded without knowing what he'd said. "You seem distracted, nephew," his uncle observed with amusement. Silas forced himself to focus. "Long week." His uncle's smile turned knowing. "The adjustments of marriage. Even our cold Silas is not immune." The comment made something in Silas's chest tighten. Cold. They all thought him cold, detached, immune to the normal weaknesses of emotion. If they knew the truth, that he was dying by inches, that every moment in Bianca's presence without being able to touch her felt like torture, that his vow of restraint was destroying him from the inside out, they would see him as weak. Let them think what they wanted. His security chief approached later in the evening, his expression concerned. "Boss, you all right? You seem tense." The understatement made Silas want to laugh. He was wound so tight he felt like his bones might snap. "Fine," Silas said shortly. "Just, you've been..." The man paused, choosing his words carefully. "Different. Since the wedding. More volatile with staff. More focused." Another associate joined them, clearly having overheard. "It's the marriage," he said with a knowing grin. "Added an unexpected stress, even for you. Sharing space with someone, negotiating another person's presence. It's not what you're used to." They were joking, making light observations about his changed demeanor, attributing it to the adjustment of having a wife, the logistics of shared space, the burden of the alliance. They understood nothing. Rage built in Silas's chest, fierce, irrational rage that had nothing to do with their words and everything to do with his own suffering. These men, his closest associates, were blind to the truth, blind to the sacred boundary he maintained, blind to the fact that he was in agony, that he loved his wife with a consuming obsession, and that his control was costing him everything. They thought he looked stressed because of logistics, because of adjustment. They had no idea he was wrestling with a love so powerful it felt like madness. "The alliance is complex," Silas said, his voice flat. "Excuse me." He walked away before his control could crack completely, before he said something that revealed too much. He found a relatively isolated corner of the ballroom and stood there with a drink he didn't touch, watching Bianca from across the room. She was laughing at something one of the women had said. Not her real laugh, Silas had never heard her real laugh, but a polite, social sound that still made his chest ache. He simply stood there, staring at a distant light, battling the overwhelming urge to cross the room just to be near her, to breathe the same air, to exist in her presence for a few more stolen seconds. He needed her so fiercely that the thought of anyone else making her smile, making her laugh, occupying her attention felt like physical mutilation. The Castellano dinner was meant to celebrate a successful negotiation, a merger of interests that strengthened both families' positions in the Southern Territories. The private restaurant had been rented out entirely, filled with the organization's elite. Crystal glittered. Wine flowed. Dangerous men in expensive suits made dangerous conversation. Silas and Bianca sat at one of the central tables, performing their usual choreography of cold civility. She looked devastating in emerald green, her shoulders bare, her hair swept to one side to reveal the elegant curve of her neck. Every time she moved, every time she reached for her wine glass or adjusted the napkin on her lap, Silas's heart stuttered. He was maintaining a conversation with an ally about shipping routes when Alexei Marchetti appeared. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. Alexei was everything. Silas wasn't. Warm, charming, expressive. He moved through social situations with ease, made people laugh, put them at ease. And according to the intelligence Silas had obsessively gathered about Bianca's past, Alexei had been her fiancé before the alliance. Before she'd been forced into marriage with a Romano. Before Silas had claimed her in name, if not in fact. Alexei approached their table with easy confidence, his smile directed entirely at Bianca. "Bianca Vitale," he said, then corrected himself with exaggerated formality. "Forgive me, Bianca Romano now." Bianca's expression shifted. Something subtle that only Silas, hyper-attuned to every micro-expression she made, could read. Her shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. She leaned back fractionally in her chair, increasing the distance between herself and Alexei. She was uncomfortable. "Alexei," Bianca said, her voice polite but cool. "What a surprise. A pleasant one, I hope." Alexei pulled out the empty chair beside Bianca without invitation and sat down. "It's been too long. I heard about your marriage, of course. Very sudden. Very political." The last word carried weight, implication. A subtle dig at the arrangement that had torn apart whatever Bianca and Alexei had been building. Silas's vision narrowed. His throat closed. His entire body went rigid with a primal surge of jealousy so intense it felt like drowning. This man had touched her, had kissed her probably, had been promised a future with her that Silas had stolen through an alliance neither of them had chosen. And now he was sitting beside her, speaking to her with the casual familiarity of shared history, making her uncomfortable in a way that made every protective instinct Silas possessed roar to life. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think past the red haze settling over his vision. Bianca was giving small, almost imperceptible signs of her discomfort, a slight movement away from Alexei, a tightening around her eyes, the way her hand gripped her wineglass just a fraction too hard. She was managing the situation with polite distance, but Silas could see the tension, could read the discomfort in every line of her body. "How is married life treating you?" Alexei asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "I imagine it's quite an adjustment. The Romanos have such a particular reputation." The comment was directed at Bianca, but the challenge was aimed at Silas. "It's fine," Bianca said shortly. Alexei leaned closer, lowering his voice to something more intimate. "You know, if you ever need a friendly ear, someone who actually knows you, who remembers what you were like before all this political theater. Bianca's face paled. Silas rose from his seat. The movement was controlled, fluid, but carried an undercurrent of lethal intent that made the conversations around them falter. He didn't look at Alexei, looked only at Bianca, his eyes asking a question he couldn't voice. "Do you want him here?" Bianca's expression answered. Her relief was minute but unmistakable. "Excuse us," Silas said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. "My wife and I need some air." He extended his hand to Bianca, an offering, not a command. She took it after the briefest hesitation, and Silas felt the contact like electricity racing up his arm. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Alexei stood as well, his expression hardening. "Actually, I was hoping to catch up with Bianca privately." "No," Silas said simply. The single word carried finality. Threat. The promise of violence barely contained beneath civilized veneer. Alexei's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. Silas led Bianca through the restaurant toward the exit, his hand at the small of her back, not possessive, but protective, guiding her away from the situation. The contact was burning through the fabric of her dress, searing itself into his palm, and Silas was acutely aware that this was the most deliberate touch they'd shared since their wedding. They stepped into the cool night air of the parking lot. The restaurant was isolated, surrounded by empty space and expensive cars glinting under security lights. "Thank you," Bianca said quietly, pulling away from his touch. "I know," Silas interrupted. "I saw." They stood there in the darkness, and Silas was trying to calm his racing heart, trying to push down the jealous rage still coursing through his system, when footsteps approached. Alexei emerged from the restaurant, his expression no longer charming. "Bianca," he said, ignoring Silas entirely. "I just want a moment." He reached for her arm. Silas moved. The time for silent sacrifice was over. The man who loved her had arrived. Everything happened in the span of 3 seconds. Alexei's hand extended toward Bianca's arm. Silas intercepted the touch with fluid, brutal precision. He caught Alexei's wrist mid-reach and twisted. Not the way someone untrained would twist, but with the exact application of force and angle necessary to dislocate the joint. The sound was dry, clinical. A snap that echoed in the empty parking lot. Alexei's scream was cut short by Silas's other hand, clamping over his mouth, silencing him with terrifying efficiency. Silas leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying enough venom to kill. "You don't touch her. You don't speak to her. You don't look at her. If I see you near my wife again, I will do much worse than break your arm. Do you understand?" Alexei nodded frantically, his eyes wide with pain and shock. Silas released him. Alexei stumbled backward, clutching his ruined arm, and fled toward his car without another word. The entire interaction had been quick, efficient, and entirely unseen by anyone else. The restaurant's entrance was around the corner. The parking lot was deserted. No witnesses, no consequences. Just Silas and Bianca, standing in the darkness while Silas's hands still trembled with barely contained rage. He turned to face her, and what he saw stopped him cold. Bianca wasn't afraid. Wasn't horrified. She stood frozen, yes, but not by fear of Silas. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow, and in her expression was something Silas couldn't quite name. Shock, yes, but underneath it, something else. Recognition, understanding. She'd witnessed the cold ruthlessness he was famous for, the violence that made his name whispered with fear. But this time, it had been aimed at protecting her heart, not conquering it. "We should go," Silas said roughly, his voice not quite steady, "before anyone notices." He turned toward the car, but Bianca's voice stopped him. "Silas." He looked back. She was still standing there, backlit by security lights, and her expression had shifted into something complex that he couldn't read. "He was going to touch me," she said quietly. "And you—" "I will always stop anyone who makes you uncomfortable," Silas interrupted, and the words came out fierce, unguarded. "Always, no matter who they are, no matter what it costs me." Bianca stared at him for a long moment, and Silas stood there letting her see whatever truth was written on his face, the protective fury, the jealous rage, the love he could no longer fully hide. Then she nodded once and walked toward the car. Silas followed, and when he opened the door for her, their eyes met briefly in the dim light. Something had shifted between them, not broken but cracked open. A door opening onto possibilities he didn't dare imagine. They drove home in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Charged, aware. The space between them in the car felt smaller somehow, more intimate, though neither of them had moved closer. When they reached their suite, Bianca paused at the entrance to her bedroom. She looked back at him, and her expression was no longer cold. No longer filled with contempt. It was confused, conflicted, considering. "Good night." "Silas," she said softly. It was the first time she'd said his name without hatred coloring the syllables. "Good night." "Bianca," he replied, and watched her disappear behind her door. Silas stood alone in the common area of their suite and stared at his hands. The hands that had broken another man's arm in a parking lot because that man had dared to reach for what was Silas's to protect. He wasn't sorry. Would do it again. Would do worse. Because somewhere in the last weeks of living beside her, of watching her, of loving her from an agonizing distance, Silas Romano had stopped being the cold air everyone feared and become something more dangerous. A man who would burn the world down for the woman who slept 20 feet away, separated by walls and vows and her own justified hatred. A man who had finally shown his wife exactly what kind of monster he could be. And terrifyingly, wonderfully, she hadn't looked afraid. The change was subtle at first. Bianca stopped orchestrating her movements to avoid him. Stopped treating their shared spaces like minefields requiring careful navigation. She would enter the common room while he was working and settle into a chair with her book without the rigid tension that had characterized her every movement before. She observed him now, the way he'd been observing her, with careful attention, as though trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Silas felt her gaze sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, would glance up from his work to find her watching him with an expression that was no longer contempt, but something closer to confusion, to consideration, as though she was reassessing everything she'd believed about him and discovering that the reality didn't match the reputation. He didn't push, didn't try to capitalize on the shift, just continued existing in her presence with the same careful respect he'd shown since their wedding night, honoring his vow even as his love for her grew more consuming by the day. One evening, Silas was in his study, the small office he'd claimed for late-night work, reviewing contracts until past midnight. The house was silent around him. He assumed Bianca had gone to bed hours ago. Then the door opened softly. Silas looked up to find Bianca standing in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She held a tray with a fresh pot of coffee and a cup. She didn't speak. Didn't explain. Just crossed the room and set the tray on his desk, careful not to disturb his papers. The coffee was exactly how he took it. Black, strong, the expensive blend he preferred but rarely bothered to make for himself this late. She'd noticed. Had paid attention to small details about him the same way he'd been cataloging everything about her. Their eyes met briefly. Bianca's expression was carefully neutral, but something in her gaze, some softness, some acknowledgement, made Silas's chest tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded once and left without a word. Silas stared at the coffee pot, at the steam rising from the cup, at this small, profound gesture that meant more than any declaration could have. She'd offered him something. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but recognition. Acknowledgement that he'd kept his word, that his actions in the parking lot had meant something, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the monster she'd believed him to be. His hands were shaking as he lifted the cup. The coffee was perfect, hot, strong, untouched by any bitterness. He savored the warmth spreading through him, the knowledge that Bianca had made this for him, had thought of him, had cared enough to offer this small comfort. Her silent offering was worth 1,000 words of peace. and Silas sat there in his study, drinking coffee his wife had made, feeling an overwhelming surge of love and gratitude that made his vision swim. This was surrender. Her surrender, small and careful and precious beyond measure. And he would die before he did anything to betray the trust implicit in that simple gesture. The shift accelerated after that night. Bianca's contempt was gone, replaced by something electric and charged that made the air between them feel alive. She no longer avoided Silas's gaze. Instead, she sought it out, their eyes meeting across rooms with an intensity that made his heart race. She began to linger after their required time together was done, finding excuses to remain in his presence. She would bring him coffee in his study and stay to ask questions about his work. Would settle into the chair across from him in the library and read while he worked, the comfortable silence between them speaking volumes. Silas felt like he was dreaming. Like he'd wake up and find her gone, the walls rebuilt, the distance restored. But each day she stayed closer. Each day the barriers crumbled a little more. He responded by making his love undeniable through action. He noticed when she was cold and adjusted the temperature. Noticed when she struggled to reach something on a high shelf and quietly moved items to accessible heights without being asked. Noticed the books she lingered over in the library and had them delivered to her room. Small acts of service, small declarations of devotion that required no words but spoke volumes. He was reckless with his feelings now, no longer trying to hide the way his eyes followed her, the way his entire body oriented toward her presence, the way he existed in a constant state of awareness centered entirely on her. Bianca noticed. How could she not? And instead of retreating, she seemed drawn to it, to the intensity of his attention, to the worship implicit in every gesture, to the man who loved her with such consuming obsession that it had become the defining fact of his existence. One evening, they were in the study together. Silas had been reviewing financial documents, but his concentration had long since dissolved into simply watching Bianca read. She sat curled in the leather chair by the window, lamplight painting her in gold, completely absorbed in whatever book held her attention. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Silas realized, with a clarity that felt like revelation, that he would be content to spend the rest of his life exactly like this, watching her read, breathing the same air, existing in her orbit, even if she never fully let him in. The hour grew late. Silas finally closed his laptop and stood to leave, to retreat to his chaise lounge and another night of restless half-sleep. But as he moved toward the door, Bianca's voice stopped him. Silas. He turned. She'd set down her book and was standing now, facing him across the study. The lamplight caught in her eyes, made them luminous. Stay, she said quietly. Just stay a moment. Silas froze. His heart was hammering against his ribs, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He stood in the doorway, giving her space, giving her control, waiting to see what she needed. Bianca moved toward him slowly, deliberately, crossing the space between them with measured steps. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, could smell the subtle scent of her perfume. The silence between them was profound, loaded with weeks of unexpressed longing, of agonizing restraint, of a love that had grown in darkness, and was now finally, tentatively, reaching toward light. Then Bianca lifted her hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving him every chance to step back, to maintain distance, but Silas couldn't have moved if his life depended on it. He stood perfectly still as her hand rose, as her fingertips brushed the lapel of his jacket near his shoulder. A touch so light it barely registered physically, but landed with the force of an earthquake emotionally. Her fingers lingered there, resting against the expensive fabric, and through it Silas could feel the warmth of her touch like a brand. You kept your vow, Bianca said softly, her voice carrying wonder and something that might have been gratitude. Every day, every night, even when I was cruel, even when I gave you no reason to. Silas's practiced control was dissolving, his carefully maintained walls crumbling under the weight of her acknowledgement. I gave you my word, he managed, his voice rough. My word is all I have. No, Bianca said, and her hand pressed more firmly against his chest. You have more than that. You have honor. You have strength I didn't understand. You have... She stopped, struggled for words. You have my respect, she finished quietly. And maybe more than that. Silas closed his eyes, felt her hand against him like an anchor. Like salvation. Like everything he'd been denying himself concentrated into one point of contact. A single, powerful breath left his lungs as if he'd been holding it for the entire span of their marriage. He was no longer a cold king, but a man drowning in the beautiful, agonizing reality of her acceptance. Bianca. He whispered her name reverently on his lips. Her hand remained on his chest, and through the fabric he knew she could feel his heart racing, could feel the physical evidence of how completely she'd undone him. I was wrong about you, she said, about what kind of man you are. I thought you were like the others, cruel, selfish, taking what you wanted without care for the cost. But you're not. She stopped again, searching for words. You're extraordinary, she finished, and the word held reverence that made Silas's chest ache, and I've been blind. They stood there in the study, her hand on his chest, his heart beating frantically beneath her palm, and Silas felt something fundamental shift between them. Not just acceptance, but recognition, understanding, the beginning of something that felt like coming home. May I? Silas started, then stopped, unsure how to ask, what to ask for. Bianca's lips curved into the smallest smile. You may stay, she said. In the study. With me. Just stay. So he did. They returned to their chairs, Bianca to her book and Silas to his work. But everything had changed. The silence between them was comfortable now, intimate, charged with possibility. Every time Silas glanced up, he found Bianca watching him. Every time she turned a page, he was aware of it. Hours passed. Neither wanted to leave, to break the spell, to end this moment of quiet connection. When Bianca finally stood to retire for the night, she paused by Silas's chair. Her hand came to rest briefly on his shoulder. Another touch, another acknowledgement, another small surrender. Good night, Silas, she said, and her voice held warmth that made his breath catch. Good night, Bianca, he replied, and watched her leave with his heart so full he thought it might burst. After she'd gone, Silas remained in his chair, staring at the place where she'd stood, feeling the ghost of her touch on his shoulder. She'd touched him twice in one night, had acknowledged his love, his honor, his worth, had given him more in those moments than he'd dared hope for in a lifetime. The walls of ice he'd built his life upon were vanishing, replaced by the profound, overwhelming relief of being seen, of being known, of being loved, even if she hadn't said the words yet. Silas stood and moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds, and felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Hope, Bianca Vitale, his wife, his obsession. His salvation was finally, tentatively, letting him in, and Silas would spend the rest of his life proving that her trust wasn't misplaced. The following days unfolded with a sweetness that felt surreal. Bianca stopped retreating to her room immediately after dinner. She began joining Silas in the evenings, sometimes in the study, sometimes in the library, sometimes simply sitting, together in comfortable silence while he worked and she read. The charged tension between them remained, but it had transformed from antagonistic to anticipatory, as though they were both waiting for something neither could name. Silas was hyper-aware of every moment, every smile she gave him, small, tentative, but genuine. Every time she sought out his opinion, asked him questions, engaged him in conversation that went beyond mere civility. Every casual touch, her hand brushing his when she handed him coffee, her shoulder barely grazing his when they stood together looking at documents. He was living in a dream he'd never dared imagine. One evening, a week after their moment in the study, Bianca appeared at the entrance to his office. She wore a simple dress in deep burgundy, her hair loose around her shoulders, and the sight, of her standing in his doorway made Silas's heart stutter, but it was her expression that stopped him completely. Her eyes were clear, luminous, and filled with something that looked like affection, like warmth, like the walls had finally, completely come down. "Silas," she said, and his name in her voice sounded like coming home. He stood slowly, unsure what was happening, but feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like significance made tangible. Bianca walked toward him, not hesitant, not uncertain, but with the deliberate purpose of someone who'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could count her eyelashes, could feel the warmth of her presence like standing in sunlight. Then, without a word, she reached up and gently cupped his face in both hands. The touch was electric, devastating, perfect. Silas felt the tension in his jaw beneath her palms, felt the slight tremor that ran through him at the contact. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, giving her complete control. Bianca's thumbs brushed along his cheekbones, a gesture so tender it made his eyes sting. She was looking at him with an expression that held wonder and certainty in equal measure. "I was afraid of you," she said softly. "Afraid of what you represented, what your family had done to mine. I came into this marriage ready to hate you forever." "I know," Silas managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you—" Her hands pressed more firmly against his face. "You made that impossible. You kept your vow even when it cost you everything. You protected me. You honored me. You loved me when I gave you no reason to." "I couldn't help it," Silas said, and the words came out rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you, I know," Bianca interrupted gently. "I see it now. I see you. And Silas—" She paused, her eyes searching his face as though memorizing every detail. "I love you," she said. "Completely, irrevocably. I love you in ways I didn't know were possible. I love your strength and your honor and the way you look at me like I'm the only thing in the world that matters." Silas's eyes closed. A single, powerful breath left his lungs as if he'd been holding it for months, years, his entire life. His hands came up slowly, carefully, asking permission. When Bianca didn't pull away, he covered her hands with his own, holding them against his face, feeling the warmth of her palms against his skin. Then he gently, reverently, brought her hands down to rest directly over his heart, where it was hammering frantically against his ribs. "Feel that," he whispered. "That's yours. It's been yours since the moment you walked down that aisle. Everything I am, everything I have, it's yours, Bianca. Only yours." Bianca's eyes filled with tears. Happy tears. Tears that spoke of relief and joy in the end of a long, painful journey. "My Silas," she whispered, and the possessive made his chest tighten with overwhelming emotion. They stood there heart to heart, her hands pressed against his frantically beating heart, his hands covering hers, and the formal, loveless marriage that had begun with threats and hatred transformed into something sacred. "I need you to know," Silas said, his voice thick, "that my vow still stands. I will never take what you don't freely give. I will never—" Bianca's fingers flexed against his chest, silencing him. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm giving it. All of it. My trust, my heart, my future. I'm giving you everything, Silas, because you've earned it, because you've proven that love isn't about possession. It's about sacrifice, about patience, about choosing someone's well-being over your own desires." "You taught me that," Silas said. "You taught me everything that matters." They stood there as the evening deepened around them, neither wanting to move, to break the spell, to end this perfect moment of recognition and acceptance. Finally, Bianca leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. Silas's arms came around her slowly, carefully, pulling her close for the first time since their wedding day. She fit against him perfectly, like she'd been designed for this. For him. "We're going to be happy," Bianca murmured against his shirt. "Aren't we?" "Yes," Silas said with absolute certainty. "We are. Because they'd earned it. Through pain and patience, through restraint and respect, through the agonizing journey from hatred to understanding to love. They stood there wrapped in each other, heart to heart, breathing in sync, and Silas felt the last piece of ice around his soul melt away completely. He'd been cold his entire life, controlled, detached, built on logic and tactics and emotional distance. Bianca had shattered all of that, had taught him that the strongest foundation wasn't built on control, but on surrender. That real power came not from taking, but from giving. That love required patience and sacrifice and the willingness to honor someone else's needs above your own desperate desires. She'd made him better, made him human, made him whole. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "More than I knew it was possible to love anything." Bianca's arms tightened around him. "I love you too. My impossible, honorable, extraordinary man." They stayed like that until the moon rose, until the house settled into silence around them, until the only sounds were their synchronized breathing and the steady beating of their hearts. The Mafia Heir and the enemy's daughter, standing heart to heart, the vow of restraint transformed into the sacred silence of a love that was finally, fiercely, completely, their own. A love built not on passion's first fire, but on the slow burn of respect earned and trust given. A love that would weather anything, because it had been forged in the crucible of sacrifice and patience. A love that had rewritten them both. And as Silas held his wife, his Bianca, his heart, his home, he knew with absolute certainty that every agonizing moment of restraint, every night on that uncomfortable chaise lounge, every time he denied himself what he wanted most, had been worth it. Because she'd chosen him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and that made all the difference.